Well, howdy guys and gals, welcome back to the Social Regressive and part 6 in our massive optics series, where we're talking about all the things that go into a rifle scope and how to select the best one for you and your individual situation. There are certain personal things that we need to take into account when we select a reticle. That's what we're going to be talking about today. And we also need to be thinking about the rifle, the cartridge, how much drop we're dealing with, what sort of effective distances that we have. But mostly we need to be thinking target-centric. We need to be thinking about what we're trying to hit, what size it is, how far away it is, how mobile it is, how dangerous it is, and how many of them there might be. This is going to affect what kind of reticle that we select. If you've missed any other parts of the series, please go back, because we're going to be talking about MOA and MRAD, and we're going to be talking about first focal plane and second focal plane, and we're going to be talking about magnification. So as much as you can understand about those things, it's going to help when we're talking about reticles here today. All right, we're going to start out on the simple side. A lot of you guys have rifle scopes, or you have at least seen the simple rifle scopes that have a crosshair in there. These are wonderful because think about what we're trying to do here. A scope is a telescope that we have mounted to the top of a rifle, and we want to use it not only to see our target, but in order to make a very precise hit. So we need something inside there, suspended inside the scope, that's going to give us either dots, lines, something that's going to give us some kind of index vector to say, this is where you aim your rifle when you take the shot, and you will make the hit at this certain distance. The most common rifle scope that you're going to see out there that fits that bill is going to be your 3 to 9 by 40. It's just going to have a couple of crosshairs on the inside. And this is a wonderful reticle for most deer hunters. They're going to be dealing with distances that are pretty limited. Somewhere between 50 and 200 yards is probably where the average shot is going to take place. And so you don't need a whole lot of stuff. You don't need to be able to take a whole lot of measurements. As long as you have a decently flat shooting cartridge, as long as you just kind of point that crosshair at your target, you're going to hit within minute of lung. It's not going to be any sort of problem. It's going to be very clean. It's easy to see usually against whatever kind of background that you have. You get some nice big thick lines with a lot of these modern crosshair reticles like the duplex ones. You get thick lines that narrow down to little ones so you can see a bit more precisely for your exact shot, but you have those big thick ones that make it easy to find in the brush. It's actually a really intelligent reticle, and it works really well, like I mentioned. I'm sure that most targets have been taken with that sort of reticle. What a lot of people don't realize is that there's actually more data in that reticle than might appear at the beginning. And a lot of time, if you look in the manual for your scope, you're going to see what they're talking about. For example, the thickness of those lines actually has some kind of measurement, depending on what scope you bought. And usually, how you have those thick lines that go down to the littler ones, that is actually going to be a certain measurement. It's going to be an angular unit of measure. So we talked about MOA versus MRAD. Usually the distance between where those two kind of narrow down and become thin little bars, that's usually 12 MOA. It kind of depends on how your scope is and how it's set up. Again, look at the manual, but you can actually use that to help range your target. So if you know the size of your target and how many MOA that's going to cover at a certain distance, you can use it to figure out, okay, my target is only covering 6 MOA, so it must be double the distance that it normally is. You can use those to measure, and you can use them to adjust for your drop as you get into longer shots. You can use it to hold over, and that's where we start to get into some more interesting reticles. Yeah, that's the most simple one, and it does still have that extra bit of data, but some of these are really going to cram the data in, and kind of based on how adventurous you are and what kind of precision you want from your shot and how you want to take the shot in the first place, one or more of these reticles might be right for you. The very first scope I ever had is this little guy right here. This is the Simmons gold medal pistol scope. My dad bought this and the revolver that came under it, and this has, you know, kind of duplex reticle, so you can use this for limited amounts of hold off or hold over. And I really like this a lot. But then when my mom bought me my first varmint rifle, it was in .243 Winchester. It's the telekinesis rifle that I showed in some of the previous videos. I I had to try to figure out, okay, what kind of reticle do I want with this? What kind of scope? I intended to be able to shoot targets very precisely and hopefully get into varminting, shoot some prairie dogs, and eventually I did that. But for that, I figured I needed a little bit more data. The crosshair is kind of cool, but if you're trying to hit something at distance really precisely, it's really kind of a letdown. Unless you dial your turrets, and those turrets are very accurate and precise, then you can't really make a lot of those super precise hits. So I decided to go with this right here. I've talked about this scope already a bunch. I've just spent so much time with this scope that it's kind of one of the things I like to chat about. This is that 8.5 to 25 by 44 second focal plane Mueller tactical scope. And this has an adjustable objective up here. This has a 25 power max, as I mentioned, and it has a mil-dot reticle in the second focal plane. If you missed the talk about second focal plane versus first focal plane, go check that out so you can understand a bit better what I'm going to say here. But if I dial this back to 10 power, if I'm on 10x, then the reticle that's inside here, it has that kind of crosshair, but it adds dots every 1 milliradian. This is what we call a mil-dot scope, and it's been around a very long time. It's a wonderfully useful scope. It's one that gives you some elevation and some windage adjustment and allows you to be very precise with your shots. You can actually hold off and hold over at the same time without having to dial any turrets, and you can make a very precise hit on a small object, as I have done very many times, turning prairie dogs inside out using the fabulous mil-dot reticle. But that's actually one of the simpler ones that we have on the market right now. There are plenty more that start to add more capabilities. So that one is measuring what we call some kind of angular unit of measure. It's a standard one, so it's not really thinking about what cartridge you have. It's just going to measure a certain milliradian amount, or if you have an MOA one, it's going to measure a certain MOA per dot. But then some of these are going to start adding that little bit of extra data, like I said. Most of these are still based on the original crosshair, and they're going to have the crosshair still sitting in there. But you might get into mil hash, for example, like with the Falcon M18 that I keep talking about. This has either an extended mil dot that has both lines and dots, like this one right here, or I've used a model that has mil hash lines every so often. So this one is going to measure a full milliradian, but then it's also going to have half milliradian markings, so I can make hits that are even more precise than the last one. I'm not trying to kind of fit into an empty space. I can actually have an extra line if I need for that little bit of extra precision. This scope is FFP as well, so it doesn't matter what zoom I'm on, no matter what the magnification, this is always going to measure true. I just might be able to see more targets around my target. I might be able to give more of a lead when it's backed off. And then if I zoom all the way in at 18x, and maybe I can see more detail about whatever target I'm trying to hit. This scope is all matched all the way around. This is totally milliradian, both in the turrets and in the reticle. And so this makes a very quick and easy scope to use. I can very easily make adjustments for whatever shot that I need, and I can plot in a solution really easily for hitting a target at longer distances. There are a fair number of scopes now that take that sort of formula where you have a whole bunch of either hash lines or dots, or in the case of the SWFA SS scopes, it has what's called the mil quad. So you have these diamonds that mark off your full milliradians, and then you have little lines that indicate some of the smaller ones. And some of these are going to measure all kinds of different little units of measure. So you may have the full milliradian and then the half milliradian, but then you may also have, like the diamonds themselves are going to have a certain angular value, and you can use that if you need to range your target, if you need to figure out, what kind of size you're dealing with. All of those are going to have their own functions, and you can use them to start to break down and get more precise ranging and more precise shots. And that's where we get into some reticles that really start to add tons of data. So these are ones where you still have the dots that are kind of clustered along the crosshairs themselves. But then you get into Christmas trees, like we have the Bushnell Deploy MRAD FFP reticle back here. This is a lot like my favorite reticle, the H59. We'll talk about that here in a second. But what this does is it has a whole lot of dots and lines that kind of extend beyond the typical the crosshairs with the lines on them. It goes beyond that. So if you need to make an extremely quick shot on something that is maybe at extreme distance, you want to be able to hold off a certain amount, then you can use one of those dots, correlate it with your ballistics chart, and then you can make the hit. And if you miss, and somebody, you can either see how far off you missed or somebody can tell you, you can adjust maybe one more dot and make the other hit. This is the kind of reticle that I love. It's totally agnostic to the cartridge. So as long as I have my ballistics chart and I know what kind of drops and windage values that I'm dealing with, then I can use this with any cartridge at all, even a 22. This particular scope is really fine. I recommend that you check this out. The forge has excellent glass. It has a great big 50mm objective. This is one that they have built not only for prone work, but for kind of long-range hunting as well, or at least extended range if you want to be able to make more precise hits. And yes, this does work really well. We'll talk about this scope in another video. But that one is actually kind of basing its setup on something called the Horus H59, which has been around a long time. And they've had other versions as well. But the Horus H59 is still one of my favorite reticles of all time. This is one that has all kinds of data. Again, it is agnostic to whatever cartridge that you're shooting. As long as you know your drops, you know your various windage values, and you can read the wind out there, you can adjust for pretty much any shot you want without ever having to touch those turrets. All you have to do is just hold up, hold off, make the shot. And if you do want to make a more extreme shot out at very, very long distance, like we did with 6.5 Creedmoor in a mile, you can take that reticle, dial the turrets all the way up as far as you like, use the extra reticle on there if you need to, if you don't have quite enough that you can dial in, which is what we did. I think we had to hold an extra 3 milliradians up and then hold off a certain amount for windage. Then you can start to make those nutty shots at really long distance. Another type of reticle that people see a whole lot is one that's tuned for the ballistics of your particular rifle. So with one of these, like the Deploy MRAD that I'm talking about, or the H59, you have to have your chart, you have to kind of know your drops, and then from there you can adjust. However, if you're out in the field deer hunting and you have targets at multiple different distances and you want to be able to address those without, maybe having to memorize everything, you can actually have some reticles that aren't based on those angular units of measure. Instead, it's based on your ballistics. That's how we get the ballistic drop compensating reticles, like the one that we get here in this Nikon pistol scope. Unfortunately, I don't think Nikon makes this anymore. If you can find one, these are great. This is a 2.5 to 8 power. They make some fixed power models as well. And this one has what we call a BDC reticle. The dots on here, okay, so you have a regular crosshair, but it also has dots that aren't at kind of fixed intervals. And what this is for is allowing you to kind of designate distances for each of those dots. Using one of the applications that they have, you can do this math yourself if you like, but it's usually a lot easier to grab one of the applications that Nikon or Bushnell has set up. Like Bushnell has their drop zone BDC reticles, and you can enter the ballistics for your cartridge and typically you zero your rifle at 100 yards with the scope, and then it'll tell you at a certain zoom, since this is an SFP scope, like say here at 5x, then line number 2 is going to be a 200-yard drop. Line number 3 is going to be a 300-yard drop. A lot of these will go out to either 500 or 600 yards. This one I think only has 3 dots because it is kind of a smaller scope. But yeah, this one probably stops at about 300 yards with some of the cartridges that I used. But it kind of depends on your ballistics. You can put one of these on a 22, and instead of being hundreds of yards, it could be tens of yards. These are really cool, and for the most part, you're going to have kind of a fixed power that you're stuck to, unless you start to get into really close range shots, and you can just dial back to the lowest one and put the crosshair on it and make the shot. There are a gob of people that make reticles like this one, this BDC. You're going to have all the big companies, Bushnell, Leupold, Vortex, everybody has one of these at least somewhere. And a lot of the low power variable optics that you get for your AR-15s and AR-10s, these are going to have those kind of reticles on the inside. Myself, I find limited use from those. I understand them, I like them, but for myself, I find them to be a little bit too limited. I do like having the extra data that I get from some of these crazy scopes. But again, it kind of depends on what situation I'm in and what my rifle is set up for. Since there is just a little bit of imprecision in a reticle like that, you're getting, roughly this is 200 yards, roughly this is 300 yards. This is going to be better for your larger targets. So we're kind of coming back to that target-centric view. If you're dealing with deer or hogs, something that's kind of in the medium, largish side of things, then that kind of reticle makes a whole lot of sense. If you're dealing with smaller targets, you may want to be looking at one of those other, like the H59 that I talked about, that's going to get you a little bit more precision, and especially is going to allow you to deal with difficult windage at distance. Those are your three main reticles. You have the crosshair or post type that's not going to deliver a whole lot of info. You have your angular measurement type, as simple as mil dot all the way up through the Horus H59 or Tremor. And then you have your ballistic drop compensators. And some will actually have elements of both. And there are some extra tricks that people might throw in as well. For example, let's talk about the ACSS reticle from Primary Arms. It's a reticle that's gotten so much press, so much attention, and is so well built that other folks have started picking it up as well, buying that reticle and just putting it into their own scope. This one has a ballistic drop compensator as kind of its main feature, and you can see that it has this chevron up at the top to help indicate that 0 point. But then with some of these, you're actually going to add some angular measurement dots as well. And then with some of these, you can actually get into windage dots off on the side, or a chart on the side as well that can help you to range targets. So if you know the height of your target, you can use this to figure out how far away they are. Really cool setup. And then with some of the really crazy ones, like my personal favorite reticle, the Horus Tremor 3, this has dots and lines all over the place, and the big ones are the wind dots, because for a person like myself that likes to shoot at longer distance, and here in Oklahoma we have a lot of wind, that's my primary obstacle. I'm not so much worried about my drops. As long as I have my chart, I know what that is. But the thing that's going to vary a lot is going to be how much windage I'm dealing with. And if I can estimate how much wind I'm looking at, either by using one of the handheld anemometers or by looking and seeing objects moving past or watching the mirage, then I can use those dots to figure out how much wind. I don't have to take my eye out of the scope. I don't have to dial anything. All I have to do is just bring up to the appropriate drop, adjust for the correct wind, and then I can make a hit, and it works really well. This one also has lines for figuring out the speed of a target and for figuring out ranging. This is a really sweet reticle and has a whole lot of stuff. But that's where we start to get into one of the big controversies, one of the things that you need to figure out for yourself. How much stuff do you actually want in your scope? For some people, it's just going to be confusing. It's going to be a mess. It might obscure certain things. For example, if you're an F-class shooter, you just want to be able to see your target perhaps, and then be able to see some wind dots. So there might be a reticle that's set up specifically for you, and actually there are out there. But if you are a deer hunter, you might want to stick with something relatively simple so that if you are in, kind of cross timber sort of area, you can continue to see it. And yeah, some folks just want to have more data, and they're kind of frustrated by a limited amount that they get in the reticle. Like I mentioned earlier, I started out with crosshair, wanted more data, so I moved up to mil dot, and then eventually even mil dot became frustrating because as I'm trying to take a more extreme shot with more wind, then I'm having to hold over and hold off into empty space on the reticle. It's not the easiest thing to do, especially when you have some of the optical illusion sort of effects that you get with having a circle around the whole thing. It can actually start to change where you are putting your target. It's a little difficult to keep track of where the lines are. So then I really wanted to step up to something more like the Horus H59 or one that we get with the Deploy MRAD. That's where those reticles started to become more interesting to me. And maybe you'll go through the same sort of process as well. Maybe you'll start out simple and want to work your way up a little bit at a time. You just kind of see how it works for you. Thanks a bunch for watching, you guys. Make sure that you stay tuned for the next videos. Hit that notification bell down below because we have a lot more to talk about. We've hit a bunch of the main main topics so far, but we do have some other considerations before we pick that perfect rifle scope. So yeah, share this with your friends, tell them what's coming here, because I'm trying to hit all the major topics at least. Thank you to patrons of the Destructive Arts that make series like these possible, that keep me in rings, and some of the scopes that we have here, and a lot of it is down to the lights and audio that we have. Thank you to 338 Lapua Magnum patrons Sportsman's Guide, Stan and Mary and Tyler. And at the 300 Win Mag level, we have Joseph Davis, Peter, Howard, and Mr. No Name. And we have a lot of other guys chipping in $1 or $2 a month. Thanks a lot, you guys, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to like, share, and most importantly, subscribe. Even if you didn't like this particular content, go ahead and subscribe. There's probably something coming that's more up your alley. Check out this playlist right here. This is going to have videos in a similar vein to what you just watched. These 2 videos we cherry-picked for you. And finally, the Social Regressive is on Patreon. So you can become a patron of the Destructive Arts and earn some goodies while helping us to provide high-quality videos just by kicking us a few bucks a month. Thanks a bunch for your patronage.